Perfect. Merci beaucoup, Jacques. So yeah, I'm Daniel from the Centre de Formation Médicale du Nouveau-Brunswick, and today I'm going to be talking about the importance of evidence-based recommendations and hammered a bit home with some findings that I did during my doctoral study in our own backyard here in New Brunswick as it pertains to air pollution. So a bit of an overview of the presentation. I'll be starting with more what we've kind of seen in the literature, just burden of air pollution in general, the air quality regulations both on the global and Canadian level, a need for a policy shift going beyond just simply Mitton standards, before then delving in for the second half about the air pollution I study and a specific disease in this province, before doing a bit of a summary on some of the recommendations I would have as it pertains to the revisions of this Clean Air Act. So the burden of air pollution, it is indeed a global health crisis. According to the Global Burden Study in 2021, it would appear that air pollution can contribute up to as much as 8% of the total disability adjusted life years. So we're talking years lost to life, as well as how much is lost to different types of disability as how much it affects their ability to enjoy life. So air pollution, as you imagine, this includes not just premature death, but numerous diseases, heart diseases, stroke, lung cancer, the list goes on. Based on population data from 2016, if we're more specific to Canada, it would appear that about 15,300 premature deaths are attributable to air pollution each year, and that there would be total economic costs associated with just the health impacts to be about 120 billion, so about 6% of our GDP. In New Brunswick alone, according to these estimates, it would be 190 premature deaths per year, and pneumococcal costs associated still in the billion at 1.4. So air quality regulations, this is a tool that we have. The WHO, evidently, they use systematic reviews among a panel also of experts that review these to help put an emphasis on health outcomes that can be formed, values to strive for. And it's just to note that according to the most recent editions of these global health quality guidelines, they make an emphasis that even at lower levels than previously understood, air pollution can have an impact on us. So they really act as a global scope for all countries. That's where the Canadian ambient air quality standards come in, where they are a bit more specific to Canada. So these are as well based on health, but also environmental effects, and they also consider the feasibility of achieving them for the jurisdiction. So this really does serve as a driver for getting air quality improvements with continuous improvements, as they do update usually on 5-year cycles, and they're used to assess how air quality is going as they have multiple management levels as well as certain measurements over annual or 24-hour periods and not just 10-minute. And these regulations work quite well, especially when they're paired with, the Canadian Level Act, now known as the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and tighten these standards. You can see even here in New Brunswick, just a few select emissions, the trend has gone substantially down, especially if we look at 2007, around the time when, for example, diesel got transferred to even ultra low. And as a result of some of these acts, some industries, including coal burning, had to close their doors, resulting in even the bigger drop that you've noted in particular with sulfur dioxide. So this is a useful tool. Now, while it is quite drastic, relatively speaking, as we can see by this big drop, there's still a need to go beyond just simply meeting these standards. As I mentioned, air quality improvements, we mentioned with the WHO, they're mentioning that there is potentially no safe level. If we're following guidelines between the 2007 and 2016, Canada, we're fortunate, we're considered relative compared to other countries, rather low in air pollution. There's still considerable improvement in health and in equity with further decline of air pollution, even when it's modest, because we're already dealing with low exposure, we're asking to lower them further, and we're still seeing the benefit. So low-level air pollution, in quotations, as what is considered low, maybe relative to what we know, still contributes to increased health risks. In fact, long-term outdoor particulate matter, there was a study recently noted that even if it's as low as 2.5, compared to, as you can imagine, with thresholds currently, some are still at 8, we're still noticing, even though it's well below, it's associated with an increased risk of death. And the CAQ green management level standards, as you can see, we even have some as low if it's deemed to keep areas clean. In quotation, as we yell yes, we might not have 0 due to certain background pollution that exists. We are able to go down further than 4, as we can see that even at 2.5, we cannot consider this clean if they're indeed an arbitrary standard where health effects are still being impacted. So a sentiment shared by the WHO recently has been there is no safe level of pollution. And this approach is simple, that it considers the fact that, as you can imagine, we're just doing this based on the available evidence, and it can be hard to evaluate what the risk is at lower levels when there doesn't exist solid evidence for that, because studies haven't been as abundantly done in low-level pollution contexts compared to where we usually just think of high pollution areas. And just to show that we are not immune to it ourselves, during my doctoral studies, I did an air pollution as it relates to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis in New Brunswick. Be important we know what this disease is to begin with so we can appreciate the findings of this project. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, if we take as its Latin origins would insinuate, we have a morbid hardening of our nerve cells in the spinal cord that results in muscular atrophy. So we see on the left, we got a healthy motor neuron, and as it begins to deteriorate, the motor neuron is having trouble communicating with the muscle as it's losing some synapse and myelation and other stuff, which will result in a progressive paralysis for the individual. And this can be at the onset of symptoms if it's a spinal form, which is a clinical presentation of muscle weakness, clumsiness, and difficulty walking, or a bulbar form that tends to be more aggressive, slurred speech, and difficulty swallowing. It begins to blur as the disease progresses. They tend to have all of these symptoms, and while there might be only 2,500 to 3,000 people living in Canada with this, it's to note that most die within 3 to 5 years of the onset of symptoms, which may explain the rather low prevalence, as it still remains one of the most prevalent motor neuron diseases that exists. And unfortunately, the death is usually due to difficulty breathing that arises as they lose control everywhere. So what spawned this research? It came from the patients themselves. Often they would ask their clinicians after diagnosis that there seems to be a lot of ALS in New Brunswick. And according to preliminary analysis, indeed, it appears they may have been right. According to our statistics, there was 2.5 cases per 100,000, when usually there should be about 2 per 100,000. And there was even 4 clusters, regions with excessive numbers. And you can see here in Bathurst, that's just one of them. Each point represents a case. We shouldn't be doing door-to-door with rare disease such as that. So environmental influence is indeed likely, and in fact, people that are diagnosed with disease often ask us, or at least I should say the clinicians, we don't know, unfortunately, when they ask what's causing it, because it remains unknown. A bunch, 90%, there's no known family history. We consider it that's sporadic. We find the genetic mutations in both familiar and sporadic forms. And the hypothesis is thus there's small contributions from various genetic and environmental factors that would be at work. And hypothesis, according to the patients and surveys done on disease registries and rotations I was able to do with Dr. Colleen O'Connell, who was one of the primary investigators on this as well, is many people mention, hypothesis about maybe it was the fact that, they knew a lot of people that were truck drivers or worked on rails, some that, there's old mines and mills in the area, some that might be abandoned, some that are still active. And it's to note, it's interesting, these all align with good, big groups of major air pollutants that they emit. And according to a literature review that we did to help back up their hypothesis, and we'll keep the focus today to just the air one, but you're more than welcome to consult this paper that's been published in Frontiers in Neurology. We noticed that as it pertains to air pollution and ALS, it appears that 3 case control studies noticed that diesel exhaust exposure is related to it, and that nitrogen dioxide, which is actually a component of diesel exposure, among other sources of combustion, is related to disease. However, while they use geospatial measurements, it doesn't seem many people are looking at sulfur dioxide, which is also a component of a diesel exhaust and also has sources from other industries, such as fabrication and energy production. And ALS environmental studies in Canada are non-existent. And thus, that's where enters our study, where we looked at 304 cases of ALS. That was very much pretty well all the cases we could find according to the Stan Cassidy, which is the provincial ALS clinic, where almost all cases go to, from 2003 all the way to 2021. And we matched them with controls based on gender and exact age, some confounded. We want to make sure that was eliminated. 1,207 from all across randomly New Brunswick. And we looked at their environmental exposures because we had access to their residential address before the onset of disease, and obviously matching that along the same history of the controls, dating back to the 1990s, and in some cases even going back to the 80s. So basically, we take these ALS cases, we match them thanks to the MB Citizen database that exists at MBRDT, the provincial data center that's located here in Fredericton, as well as satellite campuses in other cities. We take these controls and we make sure they do not have an ALS classification code. We do not want to include people who have motor neuron disease within the control sample. And we match their postal codes to geospatial measurements that were available from the Coon consortium that have all these wonderful air pollution measurements. So we're able to evaluate, and you're welcome to consult the publication for further information on it, that was published in Environmental Research recently, to learn more about how it affected our individuals here in New Brunswick. My thesis can also be consulted by the link down below. But if I was to give a summary, out of the major pollutants that we looked at, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, which can be a byproduct of nitrogen dioxide as it interacts in the atmosphere, particulate matter, which is known to cause inflammation, and our famous sulfur dioxide, which hasn't been often studied in others, it appeared that only sulfur dioxide was related to an increased risk of ALS. And this 4.4 times per 1 part per billion increase in annual exposure to SO2, which is very drastic. However, we have to be realistic. We are in a low pollution context here in New Brunswick, relatively speaking. So if we consider the 25th to 75th percentile, with the majority of the population maybe experiencing, yes, there is some parts of the population that are experiencing that whole 1 part per billion change. But for your average Joe, when they're going outside, it's more 0.14 parts per billion. But that's still significant and is still 1.23 times more likely for every 0.14 part per billion increase in the sulfur dioxide anyway. So even after adjusting for nitrogen dioxide, as we wondered maybe it was coming from sources such as diesel, so it's often noted, it seems that the relation with SO2 exposure remains significant. So not to say it's, it can't be that, but we have to look to other sources. And in New Brunswick, the main sources, as per Environment and Climate Change Canada, would be power generation, manufacturing, and mining industries. With certainly when we're still using coal or biomass, that can be still a big source of sulfur dioxide. And when we look at by quartile, so we're divided by increasing groups of exposure, even our most extreme category, 0.37 parts per billion or more, is well below the threshold of 2.4 parts per billion that's deemed clean, in brackets, by the air quality standards by the CAAQS. And obviously this SO2, there is biological possibility. Many of the hallmarks of ALS are affected when rats were exposed to this. Obviously we can't expose humans and study what's going to be causing to them, so we look to that. And indeed, neuroinflammation, glutamate receptors, which are vitally involved, and difficulty with synaptic transmission. Also, it should be noted that pollutants emitted from industrial activities can react with other pollutants, and in a synergy manner, where all of a sudden, let's say we have sulfur dioxide and there is particulate matter that is also present. Neurodegenerative processes in cellular models were observed even at low doses, well below the standards that would be deemed clean that we speak of, as it is potentially an arbitrary standard, because studies such as this are demonstrating that it's just simply we haven't done studies at lower concentrations. And this is not even including all the effects that can occur when these pollutants interact with the surrounding environment itself. Acidification, which can cause leaching and eutrophication. A bunch of nutrients are then getting spilled into waterways, which can cause cyanobacteria blooms, which are known to release neurotoxins. It's not a guarantee. However, it does provide the appropriate environment, like a soup, where this could occur more favorably, which can be detrimental not only for us, but also for wildlife and other animals, which is something that could be a whole nother topic. Whereas me, I've just meant the focus mainly on us and the health impacts. So this research was done in our own backyard. The current findings are novel. They highlight that higher levels of ambient SO2 in regional, residential areas are linked to an increased risk of ALS in New Brunswick. And while we can't say it's solely responsible that you will get it just based on SO2, It definitely means, as I mentioned, small contributions. It is a key piece of the puzzle. And if we were to help lower that, it may prevent some people where maybe that was the declension factor, or at least prolong how long until they get the disease. And this was observed, as mentioned, despite our most extreme category of exposure in this population being more than 4 times below the threshold deemed in brackets, clean areas we want to preserve as clean regions, according to CAQS. And thus, I reiterate the WHO guidelines of the approach of there being no safe level of air pollution just simply avoids making the inference by the fact that we may not have solid evidence yet for exposure at lower levels. So this comes to the conclusion of the recommendations. How does this tie into just in general with the Clean Act revisions that we're discussing today? Well, I noted that the air quality objectives also are a part of this Clean Air Act revision, Section 8 in particular. And I was very happy to see that there's now 60 regulated contaminants with numeric objectives that are concrete with the 2026 proposal, up from 5 in 1997. A lot of research has been done, and it's only getting more explosive. That is wonderful to see. And I even saw a lot of like hydrocarbons, pyrene, we got some other metals. This is very important because I had mentioned like SO2, particulate matter. Hydrocarbons can also interact with particulate matter, and then they can link on to these typical metals that we associate as dangerous, so lead, mercury, and other, arsenic. And they're very hard to get out of the atmosphere once they do so. So keeping track of these, making sure there's lower norms, reducing the potential chances of interactions. I also saw odor-based values. This is great because it's not only just impact to health, odor, nuisance can also affect us, and irritants are still a problem for exacerbating pre-existing health conditions such as asthma. But I wonder, are we including urban planning and green spaces, and are we forcing these industries to have management plans? And when they can't reduce them further, don't exist instruments for them, at least these urban planning and green spaces might provide buffers where they're able to absorb them, and at least use, a temporary solution until we have the technology to remove it entirely. I'm glad to see we're adopting the Canadian air quality standards, so some of them are a bit lower compared to the WHO. They're more contextualized to what is feasible here and what is actually realistic to even at low levels of exposure, there's still benefit to be gained. And combined with MB's air pollution objectives, this ensures that not only do we have the longer average times of exposure, we have shorter terms that we can have with our monitor stations, not only with government, but also the industry monitor stations. However, I wonder if there should be more frequent systematic revisions to the air quality objectives. 1997 to 2026, that's way too long. And especially with the scientific literature always getting exponentially quicker to find new evidence, it's important that it be sooner. So do we at least, at the bare minimum, match it every 5 years, similar to the CAQS? But don't neglect the fact that maybe, and I believe this is in section 14, maybe advisory commitments to actively update on maybe a yearly basis as new evidence emerges, because sometimes we might get these drastic changes that we notice that we really do need to bring those levels lower. It will also match up nicely with 5 years for these permits. If we're able to do on a yearly basis, we might be actually able to incorporate in advance, if we know what the standard is going to look like in 5 years from time, making sure they're progressively getting towards that standard. So rather than just telling them at the end of 5 years, sorry, you got to shut down, which we do have to consider still, that Caribbean economic impact, by ensuring that the entrustment is being enforced in some manner and they have a plan, it will be more an adaptation and actually helps these industries. They're now going to have a more long-term solution to be up and running. And evidently that comes with the needed policy shift that we need. So this could extend to not only simply just replacing, for example, coal with biomass burning, whether it be wood or if we're choosing burning diesel gas, those wouldn't be good solutions because there may be alternatives in bracket, but they still do not reach the fact of there being no safe level of pollution. Needing to get as close to zero, or at least the background pollution that naturally exists, that needs to be. So again, if we can incorporate these new targets even within the permits themselves to ensure it's not just every 5 years, but they know what the vision is, it will ensure that they're actually able to meet them and they benefit from these clean energy transition, which will actually reduce their costs long term as well too. So there's benefits for all. And evidently, as it comes to, I notice you're also looking for advice on your data portal for monitoring. Look at Canoe. They have a very user-friendly map browser. Try to do something similar to that. Maybe you can adjust your code to get those accesses to auto-adjust. It's hard to see. And please help us researchers to have more direct link to get data from NAPS, because before 2022, archive data is not available via this. It would allow more studies on short-term duration. These are my remarks, and no necessarily the remarks of NBRDT or our partners and our references.